As you can see, France really isn't looking too hot. But what's really going on? In France, we have seen massive nationwide protests over the past 4 months. The protests started in January following a speech given by President Emmanuel Macron. In this speech, Macron stated that 2023 would be the year of the pension reforms. The exact pension reforms that he would be pushing for would be pushing back the retirement age in France from 62 to 64 and upping the amount of years you are required to work in your lifetime to receive pension, which would be upped to 43 years total. Now, as is with capitalism, the fight for any semblance of workers' rights is constantly ongoing, and we are constantly losing. This is the same with pension reforms in France. Now, the topic of pension reforms has been a very long, arduous, and contentious debate within the French government that has been going on since the 2010s. Now, even though the debate on pension reforms has been going on for a while in the French government, only recently have we heard the general public's voice on the matter due to President Macron's New Year's Eve speech. Now, this speech and the push for pension reforms was met with protests from the general public. These protests started on January 18th, about 2.5 weeks later from the New Year's Eve speech. Since the start of the protests on January 18th, we have seen continuous protests from then on. These protests have ranged from simple demonstrations and walkouts from students to marches to even to strikes and more violent protests, you could say, where people have shut down major public transport, energy production, even the roads. They have shut down major routes in Paris specifically. That is where the protests have mainly been focused, but the protests, like I mentioned earlier, have been occurring nationwide. Even small towns have decided to protest, but the major focus and the major push has been in the capital of France. And it has continued on till essentially today. But the intensity behind the protests all changed on March 16th. Initially, March 16th was the date planned for a vote in Parliament on the mentioned pension reforms. So it could have gone either way, depended on how the lawmakers vote. But reportedly, minutes before the vote was going to be held, President Macron decided to invoke Article 49.3. Now, you may be asking, what is Article 49.3? I asked the same, and then when I looked into it, I was appalled. Article 49.3 is one of the most undemocratic things ever instated in the French government. What it does is it allows the executive branch of the French government to put something into law, enact something with no vote, with no democratic vote, with no parliamentary vote, nothing. It's just, they just can do it. Now, I'm over-exaggerating a little because there are some restrictions. The restrictions being that if there is something that the general public doesn't want put in place with the use of Article 49.3, after it is enacted, the National Assembly, which is a part of the parliament, can decide to hold a vote of no confidence. Now, if this vote of no confidence passes, then the executive branch or the president and his group who have been instated will be forced to resign. They will be forced to leave the French government. Sounds great. But the major flaw and intentional problem, because 49.3, the article has been instated for almost 100 years, so it's not like they don't know of this loophole. But the major glaring loophole is that if a vote of no confidence is likely to be passed and likely to succeed, the president or one of his cronies can go, hey, this seems like we might get in trouble for this, so we'll just dissolve the National Assembly, which negates all regulation on this undemocratic tool. Now, if it is put into use and then the National Assembly is dissolved because they don't want it to get passed, well, sure, the general public might be like, hey, that looks pretty corrupt. But that's it. Like, there is no legitimate restraints on this and on the use. It's so bad that in the almost 100 years it's been in place, it has been used hundreds of times, yet there has only been one successful vote of no confidence. It has only been restrained one time. Now, that could be because it's not being used undemocratically, but we all know lawmakers, they're not always on the money. I'm not going to say that they're always corrupt, but they occasionally do. So to have a track record of like 99% is absurd. There is no way that 99% of the time politicians aren't going to act in their own interests. Now, like you may have expected, after the use of Article 49.3 on March 16th of 2023, it didn't go over too hot with the general public. There was an instantaneous protest that day that was unorganized and not planned, but then the following 3 days there was repeated daily protests voicing that the general public does not condone this. This is not the will of the people. Since they were met with major backlash, Macron and his cronies realized that they might need to fold to the people just a little. So, over the whole controversy of the pension reforms, they have met with union leaders trying to negotiate the pension reforms. But, as expected, every time that the union leaders have met with President Macron and his cronies, they have left unsatisfied with their wants not being met and have called for further strikes and protests. The protests once again fired up, you could say, on May Day. May Day is essentially International Workers' Day. It's a day of remembrance and celebration. It's to remember the struggles of the international working class in the past and to celebrate the struggles of the now. Often there is celebrations, and if there's any current movements such as the French protesting, the protests will fire up further. This, of course, happened in France, and these ramped up protests were met with extreme use of violence from the police. The violence has been used throughout the periods of protest. That is just the sad reality that we live in, but especially on May Day because of the intensity behind it changed. It has gotten so bad that people have had to have limbs amputated and or lost limbs in the protest. One man on the May Day protest lost a hand because it was blown off due to a police stun grenade. Like, they're throwing stun grenades and it's showing how dangerous they are. A man lost his hand. Reportedly, also, there was a man or a person who identifies as male with male genitalia who had to have a testicle amputated. Now, the reason for this was because the person was so brutally beaten by a police officer with a baton that it needed to be amputated. there is a line, and then there are 3 lines after that, and then there is amputation. You don't just have a testicle or a limb amputated because of a light beating. This was a brutal and targeted beating. In the clips in the intro, you saw the police swarming journalists, human rights observers who are to make sure that human rights are being protected, and general civilians. The police are so brutal, in fact, with their use of violence and their weapons that they have, that the United Nations, who are known for massacring peoples through war, that United Nation has commented on it, saying France needs to get their shit together, saying that the violence is so horribly rampant and also so racist on how the police are, because that's just fucking pigs for you. The motivations of these protests have been very clear. It has been in response due to President Macron's pension reforms, but I also want to look at the other factors that could lead into the intensity that we do see in the French protests, because they are very intense, they are powerful. And I want to just kind of look at it to see what is causing this. Now, there were a few main reasons that I at least saw. I'm not saying these are the only reasons. I'm not even saying these are the reasons. These are just some possible answers to the question I asked. Now, first and foremost is the current energy crisis that Europe is going through. France has obviously been a part of this. Now, the reason of the power failure in Europe has been mainly due to the privatization of the power infrastructure that the entirety of Europe has. We saw a lot of nationalization of the especially power industry in Europe during like the 1950s. France also included in this, where they created a company and they created a state monopoly, because they obviously have to play by capitalist rules, but they created a company that is owned by the state and functioned as a monopoly, and they bought up other companies in the same sector. But over the past 100 years, or less, 80 years, I apologize, over the past 80 years or so, the nationalized industries have slowly grown more and more corrupted. And by corrupted, I mean privatized. Same thing. I just want to clear that up. This happened in France, this happened in Europe. And why, you may ask, does privatization lead to failures like we saw in this winter, where there was days of just power grid failures where there wasn't enough power? Now, this is because as you privatize, meaning you open shares of the company up to the public or other millionaires, this creates a motivation. Instead of the power companies existing for the people, they now exist for their shareholders. This is also just how corruption and how corrupt capitalism is that because the companies are not owned by the people, they will not work for the people. They instead work for their owners, the shareholders. This is a major problem, especially in such a critical industry like the power industry, because now that they are focusing on their shareholders, they don't care about reliability. They don't care about efficiency. All they care about is profit. And they can do that by opening and appealing to as many people, advertising, PR. But the failures that we saw in this winter are a cause of not caring about your reliability and caring about profits. Because what happened exactly was there was so many power plant failures that they were simply, they didn't have enough power, because there was so many plants that failed that it all kind of collapsed in on itself. The privatization of the energy industry has not been the only failure of not only the French government, but the entire world's governments, you could say. Another major leading cause to unrest in the general public is the lack of housing and the difference between inflation and wages. The difference between a living wage and minimum wage is abhorrent, and the difference between the rise in wages and the rise of inflation is also horrid. Now, capitalists and business owners are obviously to blame because that's what they do. They own the business, they dictate the wages. But this is also a failure of the governments, because the governments could step in and regulate. We have a minimum wage for a reason. A minimum wage should be a living wage. I also want to make the point of the outcome that we have seen so far and kind of what we can gain from the French protests as people who are not in France. And that is mainly looking at what is required to get the will of the people done and what is done in response. What we have seen is immense protests throughout the nation. But we have seen no give in the French government, and we have also seen our fellow working class people be brutalized by state-enacted violence. This shows us that the will of the people will not get enacted through means that the capitalists set. This shows that peaceful protests ultimately will not get the will of the people unless it follows the will of the capitalists, or the capitalists do not care. Macron is very set on the pension reforms, so he has not given in, which is a very sad reality. But it is showing us that these protests are good at reaching other people, but ultimately other means are necessary to secure our rights and protect our rights. I send my condolences to the French protesters. I hope you guys stay safe. And to our fellow comrades around the world, stay safe out there and continue the fight.